Hey, and welcome to Forbidden Knowledge, a new video series about the game design of Arkham Horror, the card game, wherein I try to analyze the mechanics of individual scenarios and other ways the forces of the mythos oppose and sometimes guide the players through their investigation. There are a lot of other and more seasoned creators dedicated to Arkham Horror out there, but most of them focus on the players, discussing strategies for all the investigators, certain cards, and deck building. My perspective is to look more or less exclusively at the scenario cards to gain insight in, well, forbidden knowledge. My name is Tim, and this is episode 2 featuring The Midnight Masks, the second scenario of the core set campaign. By the time recording this episode, the scenario is out for about 4 years, so I guess everybody who found my video has played it over and over again. But I want to make clear that these videos are not just spoiler-friendly. They are pure spoilers. The series is not named Forbidden Knowledge for no reason. So, let's get started. In this episode, I want to talk about the structure of the Act and Agenda decks again. They are pretty different from those of the first scenario, and surprisingly more simple. I also want to talk about the consequences of your playthrough of The Gathering for setting up and playing the Midnight Masks. Then we look at the many different map layouts and set setup, even in comparison to those of the Return to version of Midnight Masks. All those lead up to a great achievement of this scenario, which is world building. In this episode, we will put together a map of our beloved city of Arkham in Midnight Masks and beyond. But first things first, let's do a visual representation of the overall structure of the scenario as established by the Act and Agenda decks. After you got locked up in your house with a bunch of ghouls by a rather fanatic woman in The Gathering, you decide to stroll through the streets of Arkham, asking around aimlessly in hope to find someone who denounces his fellow citizens and then take care of those. All this is established by the first and only act of this scenario. Find a bunch of clues. Those will point out who the bad guys are. Your objective is to find 6 of them, although not all 6 are to be found by the means of investigation. If you can pull this off, you get to a resolution. Throughout the scenario, there is a second option all the time. If you don't want to risk taking too long, you can head to safety with the information you have gathered, aka resign from that scenario, even with as little as none information at all. It's interesting to point out that this resolution does nothing except leading you to the very same resolution for completing your objective. And as the red border implies, losing all of your health or sanity leads to the very same thing. I know this graph is not totally correct. The resign option is found on the agenda cards, but I wanted to represent the agency of the players. Maybe there was just not enough space on the act card for the resign option, but there might be more to this. Putting a legit and also desirable action on the bad agenda cards might trick the players to think that this action indeed is not legit or desirable. Let's take a look at those agenda cards. Besides the resign option, there is nothing to them but a linear progression to doom threshold. And the same is true for the second agenda. Sorry for the scare jump, but this was exactly what happened to most players through their first playthrough of the Midnight Masks. So the agenda is counting for 14 doom in total and dropping a rather scary enemy on you throughout your given time span. But if you let the second agenda advance, 12 bells ring out across the town. It's midnight. There is no time left to investigate the city. You must act based on the information you have collected from the cultists you have found. Structuring those flowcharts with some additional lines shows that resolutions 0 and 1 can be achieved by the players at any given time during Agenda 1 and 2. After advancing Agenda 2, you'll get Resolution 2, no matter how far the progress of your investigation is. Resolution 2 gives you a penalty and should be considered the worst resolution for this scenario, although, beside the penalty, it's the same as Resolution 1. So, all 4 ways for ending this scenario: finding all the cultists, resigning, running out of time, and even losing your health or sanity lead to the same outcome. Does this mean that this scenario is predetermined and pointless? That what you do and achieve does not matter? I think the opposite is true. As I pointed out in the previous episode, restrictions are there to guide players and put them on a given path, which is pretty narrow in case of the gathering. Midnight Masks is designed to feel as free as possible. Pretty much everything is revealed from the first turn. Try to find the cultists in a given time frame, or head to safety. If it wasn't for the scare jump enemy, this scenario could be played with one act and agenda card each. Let's have a look how this open structure translates to other aspects of the scenario. First of all, there were 3 binary outcomes in the previous scenario. Did you team up with Leader Chandler or not? Did you kill the Ghoul Priest or not? And did you burn down your house or not? Teaming up with Lita results in putting her into a player's deck. She might come in handy as an ally, but does not have any impact on the scenario. So let's ignore her for now. If the Ghoul Priest is still alive, this is noted in the campaign log, which acts like a cache for enemies. So, if alive, he will be shuffled into the counter deck and you might meet him later again. Obviously, he's a very tough enemy, and though one of the worst possible encounters you can draw, but he has no real impact on the structure of the scenario. At the end of the scenario, the campaign guide asks you again if he is killed or not, which results in leaving or staying in the enemy cache for the next scenario. The third outcome, on the other hand, has a quite notable impact on the scenario. If you burn down your house, it gets erased as a location in-game, making the map smaller. For the actual playthrough of this scenario, this makes no big difference. You are losing a low shroud location with a pretty nice actionability, but nothing too important. What this really does is showcasing the flexibility of the game mechanics, and more important, that your decisions and performances of previous scenarios do indeed change future ones. Okay, let's assume your house is still standing. This represents the location placement as suggested by the campaign guide. It's a tidy and simple 3x3 grid. But I think looking at how the locations are connected, it's a bit confusing. But if you try to organize the connections rather than the locations themselves, you get something like this. Now it's obvious that Arkham is structured as 3 interconnected circuits. Contrary to what the card states, the central location is Miskatonic University, which is the meeting point of all 3 circuits. On the other hand, Rivertown, which has the Trade Central, connects to 2 locations, which are themselves not interconnected with the others, working somehow like a hub, allowing to go to several different smaller locations. This layout of Arkham is the same in every playthrough, but there are minor variations. First, sometimes your house is there, sometimes it isn't, and you have the agency to determine this. Then there are 2 locations, downtown and south side, represented by 2 cards each, from which you choose one randomly while setting up the map. The unrevealed side and all connections stay the same, but you can find different encounters on the revealed side. In downtown, you might go to the Bank of Arkham and get a few useful resources. Or you might find your way to the Arkham Asylum to get a sanity treatment. This location provides more clues than the Bank of Arkham, but due to a higher shroud value, they are more difficult to find. In fact, you get a victory point for getting all of these clues, an option the Bank of Arkham doesn't give you. These variations are random. The players have no influence on them, but instead they add some level of uncertainty of what you will find in those 2 locations. Adding all this up, there are 8 different combinations of how Arkham could be built in this scenario, although they feel all pretty samey. Let's have a look at the bad guys, the cult of Umordoth. These are the 6 cultists you try to find. 5 of them are connected to specific locations. Drew, a cannibal wolfman, is looked up in the Arkham Asylum, but you might meet him also while checking on your bank account due to the different locations. Victoria Devereux is a collector looking for a precious mask in the Curiosity Shop, which is located in Northside. Then there are Peter Warren, a professor for the occult at Miskatonic University, Ruth Turner, who is the mortician of St. Mary's Hospital, and Herman Collix, the undertaker at the graveyard. Those five and the Masked Hunter, the scare jump enemy, are the cult of Mordoth. It's the same in every playthrough. This can lead up to some kind of a heat map of where cultists in Arkham might show up. The red numbers represent the amount of move actions you need to perform to go from this location to every possible spawning location of the next cultist. This shows the map for the first cultist. The numbers obviously change after finding each cultist, but experienced players could adjust their mental heat map. I just want to point out that Miskatonic University is again the most central spot on the map. Although there is only one combination of the full cult, the scenario is luckily not always the same. There are 120 permutations of the sequence drawing those five cultists. You just don't know who's coming next, do you? Well, you pretty much do. You know for 100% that the Masked Hunter will show up at a given time. With 20, 25 and even 33%, the first few cultists might be quite hard to guess, but if you manage to find the fourth or even fifth, you can be a 50 or even 100% sure where to find them. More on that in a minute. For now, with 8 combinations of the map and 1 combination of the cult, there are 8 possible setups for this scenario. Indeed, the campaign guide varies it a little more depending on player count, but let's ignore this for today. The scenario has 7 possible outcomes, namely, you manage to find 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 6 of the cultists. Adding the ghoul priest to this doubles the number. Well, there are actually 128 outcomes, if you care which cultists you found. And the campaign guide does care by adding the names of those who got away to the very same enemy cache as the ghoul priest. Midnight Masks is by far the most popular scenario of the core set. I would argue this is because of the relatively simple structure, which results in a lot of freedom how to play the scenario, and by not having binary win or lose conditions, but rather a simple task with a huge success range from 2 or even 1 interrogated cultist to a hard-to-achieve goal of interrogating or defeating all 6 of them. Even finding none of the cultists is not a loss in itself, although there is a positive feedback loop for the final scenario, so bad results produce worse starting conditions while good results produce better. But that's a topic for the next episode. Now I want to take a quick look at Return to the Midnight Masks. 4 other locations get a second copy of themselves to put 1 into play randomly. This results in as much as 128 different combinations of Arkham. Well, the paths are always the same, but you can never know where those paths lead you to. Maybe there's a way to bribe some citizens in Northside, or you could take the train to any other location from there. Maybe you head into Velma's Diner in Eastside, in hope of finding some allies, or you go into the police station to refill your ammo, and so on. The Cult of Mordoth also got a few new members. From now on, you just know there will be a scare jump enemy after the first agenda advances, but you don't know if it will be the Masked Hunter or the even more annoying Narogath. You still know that there are 5 other cultists somewhere in Arkham, but you, the player, are nearly as unknowing as the investigator who this might be, as you randomly selected those 5 from a pool of 8 at the beginning of the game. Heat mapping this is obviously still possible, but less clear and thus less effective. There are 224 combinations of the cult, and each of those has again 120 permutations in their sequence. All this results in a much lower probability to guess where the next cultist might show up. Even the last one is just at 25%. Adding this up, 128 maps with 224 different cults produces over 28,000 possible setups. This is mind-blowing, especially when compared to the 8 setups of the original version. Keep in mind that the number of possible outcomes hasn't changed though. It's still 7, or rather 128, because of the cult combination you randomly choose at the beginning of the game is now considered the one and only Cult of Umordorth. There was a poll on BoardGameGeek to rate every scenario. I found this chart created just after the release of the Forgotten Age cycle. According to this, Midnight Masks is not just the most popular scenario of the core game, but also in the better half compared to all releases at that time, while the other 2 scenarios are at the very bottom. Funny though, Midnight Masks is the only one that got less popular through its return to treatment, and I wonder why. Sure, Narogath is a lot harder and also more restrictive than the Masked Hunter. But the rest of the changes are not increasing the difficulty, but only the variety of this scenario. This might feel more difficult, but actually it's returning the scenario to the uncertainty of its first playthrough. I would argue that Midnight Masks got easier and easier with repetitive playthroughs, or what the Return to version does is to reset their scenario to its intended form, wherein you don't know who and where the cultists are. Maybe you have some insights on why you like Midnight Masks more or less than the Return to scenario. Is it about difficulty or some other aspect I haven't covered? Just leave me a comment and I might discuss this in a later episode. I myself love both versions of this scenario because of an aspect I haven't talked about much yet, and this is world building. It might be 15 years since I first set a foot in the city of Arkham. This changed my perspective on gaming drastically and nearly got me addictive. I bought every expansion for the 2nd edition of the Arkham Horror board game and was fascinated by its game mechanics back then already. I played nearly all of Elder Sign, Mansions of Madness, Untitled Horror, and the 3rd edition of Arkham Horror. I know this town. Even though most of the cast of Midnight Masks is brand new, they act in very specific and well-known locations, as Miskatonic University, the Historic Society, or the Arkham Asylum. And that made me feel like I am back at a place I already know. These are not some random locations. This is Arkham. But is it Arkham? I pulled out my 2nd edition game board to compare and recreated the structure of the 9 different neighborhoods and their distinct locations. Let's have a look at Midnight Masks projected on this map. The connections between the neighborhoods in Midnight Masks are true to those on the game board, at least if you accept that your way goes through French Hill, the Merchant District, or Uptown to get to certain places. The graveyard is only accessible through Rivertown, as it is a distinct location of that neighborhood. Same goes for your house, a location you won't find in the board game, but which operates just like the graveyard. A little different is the case of St. Mary's Hospital, though. In Midnight Masks, there is no Uptown neighborhood. St. Mary's has to function as a stand-in on that, connecting to Southside and the university. But let's assume both ways lead through Uptown. This is the true power of the locations in the card game. One move action might bring you just to another room or to a totally different part of a city, or even to a land or dimension far, far away. Midnight Masks seems to fit pretty neatly on that board, doesn't it? If you consider all locations mentioned in the flavor text, the map begins to look even more like in the board game. And it shows that most of the neighborhoods focus on some of their locations rather than their own status of distribution to those. This makes the case of St. Mary's a little more weird. There really should be 1 or 2 cards named Uptown, one of those St. Mary's and the other the magic shop or the woods, but, well, there isn't. I really think it's awesome how dedicated the card game is to its predecessor. Not just accepting the limitations of an old game board while having the absolute freedom of interconnectable locations on cards, but embracing those limitations. This is what gives Arkham a certain kind of realness in me, a feeling of knowing the place. But this knowledge is no advantage while playing the game, it just feels good. All this made me curious. How is Arkham treated in future scenarios? So we will round this up with a short look at the Threads of Fate and Clutches of Chaos, both from later campaigns. Threads of Fate reuses most of the neighborhoods from Midnight Masks, so the connections are the same. But there are up to 7 new locations who you might find unraveling those Threads of Fate. All of them are, just like in the board game, only connected to their respective neighborhood, and also haven't moved around the city. City Hall and the Exley exhibition are new locations, but the first is mentioned before in connection to downtown and the Independence Square, and the second might just be next to the library of the Miskatonic University. Well, it's definitely on the campus. While Threads of Fate focuses on the northern half of Arkham, Clutches of Chaos goes south. Finally, adding Merchant District and French Hill to the mix. Again, there are neighborhoods and their connected locations. But this time, there are 2 connections from Southside to other neighborhoods, which weren't possible on the board without going through French Hill or Uptown. Although not true to the board, I think it's just fine to assume you could find a way around a certain neighborhood. Putting those 3 scenarios together on one map shows how close they are to the board game. There's only one connection missing between downtown and the Merchant District. The direct connection between French Hill and the university is just assumed, or rather implied by Midnight Masks and the Threads of Fate. And I took the same freedom while placing St. Mary's, which is now a real location in Uptown. But it is now obvious to me that the underlying idea of an interconnected system of neighborhoods with associated locations has been kept from the board game. Finally, there are several of the remaining locations either mentioned in these 3 scenarios or have their distinct own scenario. All of these together are building a complex and relatable world. For future episodes, this might get some background on how to build a map that feels natural, believable, and trustworthy, or maybe the opposite, unearthly, confusing, and mind-bending. Both can be interesting. And one closing note. The 3rd edition of the board game also has a modular board, chaining the connections between the neighborhoods for every scenario. This feels like Arkham is shifting around, but actually they stay true to an underlying map. I think the problem here is that because of the pictorial representation of the neighborhoods and the connecting streets, the map feels more literal. It seems like Northside is just a few steps down that road from the Merchant District. The more abstract connections of the card game allow for more associative ways to go from one part of the city to another. Next time on Forbidden Knowledge, we will go into detail on one of those locations just mentioned so far, the woods. Until then, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe even got insight to some forbidden knowledge, although I guess most of you are very, very familiar with the Midnight Masks. Thanks you again and see you next time.